Ben, does this smack as true to you? How could they possibly bring this many facilities back online?
This is why it's great that you love having war nerds like me come tell the truth.
Okay, good.
So first, let me just say,
so this is not truth then.
I'm suspect.
Yeah.
Count me in the suspect category, as the kids say, the sus category. First, we're being analytically loose with what we say is a missile.
Fair.
Missiles come in a wide variety of categories and different types. So the campaign in Iran, we have to differentiate strategic targets and operational targets and tactical targets. So to say that the bombing campaign, which I would say is largely focused in the first phase on strategic targets, command and control, leadership, long-range weapon sites, was unsuccessful is just a complete misnomer. It's just not true. Now, does that mean Iran couldn't get access to additional stored weapons underground?
Yep.
Sure. But just remember, the U.S. has air superiority over Iran. So any Iranian going with a semi-truck or a mule cart to pick up a weapon from a buried site, if hostilities recommence, is a target.
Right.
And to think that we couldn't generate sorties, meaning aircraft in the air with munitions, with ISR, to begin to attack those at a moment's notice is a misnomer. So does Iran still possess large stockpiles of missiles? Yes. We always knew that.
Okay.
Right? But are many of those sites still buried or being excavated? My guess is yes. And then three, even if they did have access, we know the access points. We've been building the intelligence.
Right.
So I think we've been cherry picking the word missile here to draw conclusions that are more about politics, to talking about a war we don't like, which takes us away from the operational reality.
Well, when we talk about unearthing, if they've been digging these missile sites out after we bombed them and effectively buried them, is there a world in which maybe we let them do that because there were possibly CIA operatives on the ground? Maybe we're setting them up to feel like they've got this covered and can roam freely. So if and when kinetic activity resumes, we know right where they are.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wild range of options. And when we think about modern military planning, usually it's about generating different options you can present to the commander. So they go up to Admiral Cooper, they go to General Kane, they go to Secretary Hegseth, they go to President Trump. And the higher commanders will determine the degree of risk. So I could see a world in which, if you ask Ben Jensen's opinion, I'm not going after every missile.
Yeah.
I want to target the system. So I want to destroy the launchers. I don't care if you have missiles if you can't get them on a launcher.
Yeah.
You saw some really interesting reporting from early in the war where there was even the possibility of mines being laid at the exit sites from some of these. So it was even harder to move the mobile launchers out. My guess is what we really need to focus on is if hostilities resume and the U.S. is asked to go deeper into the Strait of Hormuz, which it doesn't get enough attention. We've had 2 and then 3 destroyers go in and completely repel IRGC attacks. If hostilities resume, you're going to have to see balancing that campaign from Tomahawk missiles fired from ships, a lot of carrier-based aviation. All of these assets are going to be striking missile sites. And again, the more important thing, starting to hunt a different type of missile, going from strategic targets to operational. I've got to take out the anti-ship cruise missiles that are mobile. Those are actually the hard targets because it looks like any truck. They can move them around because they're mobile. So again, can we do that? Yes. We've established air superiority. We'll put the strike packages back up and we'll begin to go hunting. So I think there's a lot of range of options. And the U.S. has a lot more leverage here militarily, even though there's a lot of political bargaining on Iran's side that I think is being captured in a lot of the reporting.
Okay. So all of that said, is the resumption of strikes inevitable?
I mean, that's always a political question.
Yeah. The strait's still closed. The talks aren't working.
It is. Well, unless you're a Chinese ship, right? So we found that some of the Chinese ships have been allowed to go through, which makes sense, right? The president has to balance global responsibilities. So talking to China, which truly is our main rival, can't be disconnected from ongoing considerations of strikes in Iran. So there's a careful balancing game of what he prioritizes when. But I think that the probability certainly increases when he comes back from his trip, this historic summit. And I think the one thing we have to watch is what could that look like? And in particular, what does it look like in terms of what I really want to see is that the U.S. has made changes to its plans, gotten the right equipment in place to really do more effective counter drones, where the Iranians have surprised us, sadly because they had Russian and Chinese help, is the ability to harden some of these one-way attack drones so that they could strike some of our most valuable radars, they could hit our bases. So I want to see in this period that the U.S. military is adapted, we're in position, we can counter the drone threat, because we've demonstrated the ability to strike any target we can find in Iran. Now we got to take away their offensive punch.
You're so good at this. What do you make of this report that we've deployed a hypersonic missile or missiles in Iran? Are we just saber rattling, or are we going to use them?
Maybe, but honestly,
what would we use them for?
Look, we control the airspace. We can drop old dumb iron bombs.
Well, sure. So why would you need something like that? You're going to drop a Ferrari on Iran?
Yeah. Well, hopefully I get to drive it first. I think, again, because you can't separate, if you're the president of the United States or you're his advisors like Secretary Rubio, you're looking at a global set of problems. And so there are instances in which I do want to demonstrate one capability in a war with Iran to signal to China. If I'm in China right now, you know what scares the heck out of me? I still import all of my oil. I still import tons of food. And the U.S. military, the Navy in particular, has demonstrated it can blockade a key choke point at a time and place of its choosing. That is going to cause the little hairs on the back of Chairman Xi's neck to stand up more than he's going to publicly.
That's fascinating. That's a projection of power that nobody's acknowledging right now.
Exactly.
The other side of the coin, as it were. If we did resume kinetic activity, would it look much different? If we decided to reopen the strait, would it look different than what we've seen, and would it require troops on the ground?
I think you're asking the key question, and there's no one way to reopen the straits. I think, again, that military menu of options is pretty big. So usually what you think you would see at the beginning is you would see a resumption of the air campaign. I'd need to have constant what are called CAPs, combat air patrols, over suspected launch sites for what are called FAC, they're little Mosquito Navy, those small boats, over potential launch sites for anti-ship cruise missiles. So there's going to be a heavy air component to set conditions and shape. Then when I begin to move ships in, which I got to coordinate with industry to have them come ships out, I'm going to have that air package, and I'm going to have additional assets that include helicopters, that include destroyers, creating this layered defense around. And so the best way to do that at that lower rung is you're almost securing the sea line of communication, but you're doing it in a way where it's almost like a bait and ambush. You're basically setting conditions where the second Iran counterattacks, now you know exactly where they are, and you can resume operational strikes in depth. You can begin to hit them in those sites, hit anyone who made a cell phone call from a little boat. You're using signals intelligence, you're using imagery intelligence, and you begin to strike. So that's at the lower end. At the higher end, it could include a wider range of activities. So that could even include, there's always been discussions about small islands in the strait. You could have limited objective raids. You would want to even have deception, signal that you might do that to pull the Iranians out of position. So the opening of the strait is a doable and viable military option, but it's always a question of risk relative to the political objective the president has centered on.
And then, of course, keeping it open is a whole other mission.